She's a real woman with a real life. She's someone you can relate to. Dawn Newton.
Hey, welcome to the Dawn Newton podcast. I am your host, Dawn Newton. In 2014, MTV did a study and a poll with millennials on race. They wanted to know, do millennials understand racism? In an article dated May 16th of 2014, Slate magazine wanted to know, why do millennials not understand racism? They think if we ignore skin color, racism will somehow disappear. Well, in 2014, I brought together some millennials and I asked them about this study. I had them read it and said, let's talk about it. Asked them what they thought about this poll, what their views were. Have they ever experienced racism? And again, this was in 2014. Today's topic, we're talking about millennials, and there's a couple articles that are out there that talk about why millennials do not understand racism. Does that push a button for you, Maya, when you hear that?
Yeah, I mean, I just don't think that it's true. So
it's kind of interesting. So what we've got is there was two articles. Actually, one was a poll that MTV did, and this was done in May. And this seems to be the catalyst for all these other articles that are out there. And then this particular article was written by Jamel Bowie from Slate.com, and his article is Why Do Millennials Not Understand Racism? Well, he brought that from this poll that MTV did, and MTV is pretty extensive. Their campaign is in studying with millennials on race, bias and microaggressions, and so it's kind of interesting to hear this talk. And then once again, the millennials, that'd be you, Maya, and my other guests will be coming on, are you don't understand racism, you're colorblind, you don't like to talk about racism. So it's kind of an interesting topic that I wonder if that's really true for the millennial generation. So I talked with Steven. He is 23. He's a white male. He is working on his master's from Florida State in sports management. I also talked with Isaiah. He is a black man. He's 28 years old. He's a dancer instructor at PSU. He lives in Portland. I got some information from Isaiah, what he thought about these articles and what his opinions were. And then we also talked with Monica. She is a junior at Seattle University. She's female. She's a golfer up there, and she's also Cambodian. She's a first-generation American. Her parents defected from Cambodia. So it's kind of interesting to hear from different races and of this millennial generation to see what they have to say. So let's start with Steven, see what he has to say about these articles and his opinions. Why do millennials not understand racism? Do you feel that's a fair representation of you as a millennial being part of the millennial generation?
I think it's a fair representation of the millennial generation. I've had education in it, in the sense of, even diversity in sport was a class that I took at Florida State. So I've been exposed to aspects of it. So I think that overwhelmingly that my generation is that it is the sense of, racism was my parents' and my grandparents' issue, not mine. And as a result of that, it kind of gets pushed under the rug. And, like I said, the real issue, that article brought up that really stuck out to me is this perception of reverse racism that is now gaining track in the millennial generation, that I am discriminated as a white male in this society, when that couldn't be further from the truth. This society is set up for the white male. And so this sense of that I'm being treated unfairly now it's not fair, A, and B, you can say that certain people maybe have had an effect of it, but it's a small taste of what minorities in this country deal with on an everyday basis.
64% of young whites believe having a black president demonstrates that people of color now have the same opportunities as white people. Do you agree with that statement?
I believe that there are opportunities out there, but that it's an exception, not the rule, is kind of my viewpoint on it. It's in the same way that, our current president had to fund a $1 billion campaign to get elected, or close to it. There are still aspects of it that are still not obtainable by every American, particularly every American minority. And so just because it is obtainable for a few does not mean that it's obtainable across the board.
65% of young people of color feel that white people have more opportunities in racial minority groups. Do you feel that is true?
I completely agree with that statement. And again, that's where the issue really is, it's that this society is ran by white males. It's ran, the major media companies, the 6 major media conglomerates are owned by white males. For me being in sports, I look across the board and see white males as the commissioner of every professional sports team in North America. I see white males owning just about every professional sports team in the United States. And even, coaches across the board are white males. And, from that standpoint, the people that are making decisions are white males, and they're making decisions on behalf of white males. And so this perception that it's getting better is a perception. When it comes to the reality of the situation, no, minorities are still fighting for opportunity in the same way that they have been in the society since it was established.
Do you feel that your generation is more tolerant and diverse and profess a deeper commitment to equality and fairness, which is what was cited in the article, Why Do Millennials Not Understand Racism? Do you feel that's accurate?
I do believe it's accurate. I think that my generation is far more tolerant to differences in people, and I think that is a major step forward. Is we didn't grow up in the civil rights era. We didn't even grow up in the post-civil rights era, and that standpoint is that, I've gone to school with minorities my entire life. I've got lots of friends that are minorities. That is a huge part of growing up in the time that I have that is very different in just the way, that this country has progressed over the last 40, 50 years. So I think we are far more tolerant of it, but on the same token, that is also assuming that everyone feels that way.
The difference between racism, the true definition of it, and being prejudice.
Yeah, and that's a truly fascinating, because those terms get so... They're used in conjunction or as synonyms for one another, and they are completely different. Everybody has prejudices for whatever reason. That's part of what makes us human, right or wrong. Everyone's got it because of experiences, because of what they've seen, what they've heard, what they've been told. But it's the acting upon those prejudices that racism is a result. That's kind of the aspect of our generation, is that, when you start acting on this prejudice, that's where racism occurs. But that doesn't mean that your prejudices don't influence your everyday decisions.
Isaiah Tillman, a 28-year-old African-American man who lives in Portland. He teaches dance at Portland State University. He weighs in on this as well. Why do millennials not understand racism? Now, being a member of that generation, Gen Y, the millennial generation yourself, do you feel that that's an accurate representation of you and your generation?
I definitely don't feel that's an accurate interpretation of myself and my views and my knowledge. But for some people in my generation, it may stand true. I guess racism affects my generation slightly differently. It's still there, and it's definitely not 100% equal between all races. But we're not facing quite the same amount of intensity around these issues.
I'm going to refer to the poll because there was 2 statements that really stood out that seemed to be getting a lot of attention. Is 64% of young white males believe that having a black president demonstrates that people of color now have the same opportunities as white people. Do you feel that's accurate?
I do not feel that is accurate, just without throwing anybody under the bus. As for me, being a young black male in Portland, Oregon, I went and I interviewed for a job, and I was the most qualified candidate for this job. However, they didn't want to hire me because of the fact that I was African American, and she wasn't really very shy about that. I was working in an industry that was all about the elegance and the places where a lot of affluent people went to spend all of their money. And she felt that having a black person work there took away from the elegance of the ballroom. Those were her exact words, and that was why I had to go through 3 interviews to get hired, just for the fact that I was black. And that was, let's see, that's that's 10 years ago at this point. That's not that long ago, you know what I'm saying? And while working there, I had another friend who came and joined, and she was Hispanic and Black, and had another person who came, who just graduated from Job Corps as administrative assistant, and had all these other skills, and was a fantastic dancer, and that's what you wanted at this particular place. But she wouldn't get hired because the woman felt like there was enough color there between the other two of us, so she wouldn't hire her because she was brown. So it's definitely not equal. It's just different than it was. You know what I mean? Like there has been some improvement, and we have made strides, but it's not the same.
So let me ask you, on the flip side of this, 65% of young people of color, that could be Black, Hispanic, Asian, feel that white people have more opportunities than racial minority groups as far as job employment. Do you feel that's accurate?
In general, I would probably agree. I would probably agree. Kind of just based off of similar of what I was saying before. Is just some people can't look past race when they're looking for when they're kind of laying out the qualifications, and if someone fits into their workplace.
Jamel Bowie writes for Slate.com. He says that the millennial generation is more tolerant, diverse, and profess a deeper commitment to equality and fairness. Do you think that's a fair description of your generation? Are you experiencing that?
Generation as a whole, yes, but I mean there are people for many generations before mine that believed in equality and fairness for all, and they fought more for it. So I believe like we're more fortunate, and we're reaping some of the benefits of what people before us like have done and fought for. But if I had to weigh out who's more actively like working for it, I think the generations beforehand, like when you had to actually stand up and fight, and when you laid down your life because you believed in something, I feel like that was definitely more dedication and commitment to equality than what we have now. I think sometimes we can stand on our high horse and our very safe platforms and request that things are different and make our arguments, because we can do that now just via Facebook, but it's different than actually marching. It's different than they going through what many other generations and groups of people have done.
I've read this in several places that millennials appear to have a hard time talking about race and discrimination. Do you feel that your generation has a hard time talking about race and discrimination?
I think every generation has had a hard time talking about it.
And earlier you had mentioned that you have definitely personally experienced racism yourself. Mm-hmm. How often are you experiencing that today, 2014?
I mean, fairly frequently, I guess. I mean, I'm used to it. It just sounds kind of sad, but I mean, I'm pretty used to being looked at and being a little different. I'm pretty used to being judged based off my appearance, and I barely notice it sometimes, to be honest.
And the words prejudice and racism get those words get intermingled a little too much sometimes. At least that's what I'm hearing and reading. Do you feel that that's accurate?
Yes, for sure. Because when you mentioned that, all of a sudden I had to go back and think of the definition of both of those words and the differences between the two. I think they're so commingled, and they often do go hand in hand. But I guess it really is important to realize that there are different things, and to treat them differently, to approach them differently.
Now, Monica Keogh, she is 20 years old. She is a junior at Seattle University. She's a female golfer up at SU. She's also Cambodian. She is first-generation American. Her parents defected from Cambodia. And here's what she had to say about millennials and racism. As a millennial, that's your generation, Monica, do you feel that that's an accurate representation of you and your generation?
In a way, I do feel that's accurate. Our generation doesn't see racism as the same as an older generation, like my grandparents, and I feel that is a better definition of racism than what we think it is.
There was a poll that MTV did, and two of the questions that stand out that seem to be targeted the most is that 64% of young whites believe having a black president demonstrates that people of color now have the same opportunities as white people. Do you agree with that?
No, I don't quite agree with that, because having a black president doesn't really show much, because some people don't even think of that Obama is black. People say that, oh, he's still part white. Obama's not full black. People don't think that it's real, that Obama is African American. He's a president. Some people still think that he's part white, and they see that he's white just because he has white in him.
I think it's just what people think is that he's not a true representation of the black community. Now, on the flip side of that, 65% of young people of color, which would be any minority, whether it's Asian, Hispanic, black, feel that white people have more opportunities than the racial minority groups. What do you think of that?
That was a little harder, because sometimes you could see how growing up in Hawaii, a lot more white people had better jobs and better opportunities than those who are of color. But at the same time, that you see a lot of people who are minorities in that, quote, I guess you could say, like, upper class, that are working up into those same opportunities that the white people have.
It says also that the millennial generation, now this is going back to Slate.com, to Jamel Bowie, what he writes in his article is that the millennial generation is more tolerant, diverse, and profess a deeper commitment to equality and fairness. Do you think that represents you or your generation?
I think that my generation is more tolerant. Like, millennials are more tolerant towards controversial issues like LGBTQ and Q, but they don't have a full understanding of racism and other things besides race and class and gender.
Do you think that millennials have a hard time talking about race and discrimination?
I do. I think it's not so much as a hard time, but some things millennials don't realize is that some little things they say, like in the MTV survey, the microaggressions and bias, that some things that people say, they don't realize that it is racist. So when you want to get into a conversation about that, people automatically get defensive and don't want to talk about that at all.
Have you ever personally experienced racism?
I wouldn't say that I've experienced racism, but I have felt that I was in a minority group. Like my high school, for example, I went to Punahou in Hawaii, and our stereotype is that my school is full of rich white people. And not being wealthy or not being white, it was hard to go to that school because I felt like I had to work twice as hard as those who could actually afford the school, and twice as hard as those who made it look easy going to that school.
Well, and that's just it too, Monica, just so the listeners know, is that your nationality, you're Cambodian.
Yes.
You're first generation American.
Yes.
So that is something that, and also being a female. So there's a lot of avenues there, or as far as experiencing racism and then prejudice. And that's the other thing too, is we kind of seem to interchange those terms, prejudice and racism. Do you think those get intermingled too much, and maybe we don't know the definitions as well as we should?
I do think that they get intermingled. For example, I think my example is more towards prejudice than racism, but it is intermingled. That if I were to say that I was feeling not discriminated against, but I was a minority, people would think that it's a racist comment, or it's towards a topic of racism.
Do you think the generation that were too sensitive to those topics?
Yes and no. I think it takes certain populations that aren't sensitive to it, like people where I come from in Hawaii, we're a mixed pot of people, different ethnicities, so it's not that hard to talk about it. But in the mainland, it's kind of hard to talk about who I am, that I'm mixed, that I'm first-generation American, and people sometimes get, I don't want to say scared by my story, but people don't really want to hear it because they feel bad, I guess, in a way.
Okay, so you've heard from Stephen, Isaiah, and Monica. So let's chat with Miss Maya Hall sitting across from me here. You've been listening to this and you've read these articles. Why do millennials not understand racism? You know, they think that if we ignore skin color, racism will somehow disappear. Do you agree with that?
I think that with our generation, definitely our intentions are there, and we are trying to definitely get over that hump of, you know, how everyone's different because of their skin color. I think that the majority of my friends are like, it doesn't matter what skin color you have or if you're any type of race, we're all the same. And so I think that they are trying to use that colorblind effect to be like, if I just ignore, you know, your race, then it'll go away. And I think that we're trying to do that, and that's a way that we're trying to get rid of racism, but I don't think that it's working, in that now I think that we're just becoming, I don't want to say ignorant, but it's just something that we need to realize, like, yeah, people have different skin colors, and we have to recognize that that is a fact. And we also have to recognize that they are, you know, we're all the same and that we shouldn't be treated differently. It's us trying to, you know, not recognize it is making things worse, I think.
So let me ask you about a couple of these statistics on this poll. And these, like I said, these two questions seem to be getting the most attention. 64% of those that were polled of young whites believe having a black president demonstrates that people of color now have the same opportunities as white people. Basically, electing President Obama took care of the whole race issue.
No, that's not true. I think that, you know, people want it to be true. I mean, now that someone of color is, you know, in charge of America, he's the president of America, people are like, well, now that he is the president, people of color have the same, they're the same as whites. Not true at all in this case, because there's still that issue of racism is a prevalent issue, and even though he's president, it's not going to go away because of a whole bunch of different things. I mean,
look at the history that goes along with all of that defines that. It's pretty deep-seated and deep-rooted.
Yeah, exactly. And, you know, the Civil War wasn't even that long ago. I mean, people think about how, oh, that was so long ago. No, it's just not in your lifetime. Like,
do you think that millennials have a hard time talking about race and discrimination?
I think that comes along with the fact that we're just trying to colorblind everyone from it, and so we don't want to talk about it. Also, I think that it's a big issue that we don't know how to talk about it because there's so many different terms that aren't clearly defined. So I could say, oh, this person is black, and it could cause something, versus if I said this person is African American. I mean, there's so many different terms, and they're all changing and evolving, and, you know, this is the right way to say it, and this is the wrong way to say it. Those are all constantly changing, which is so confusing to us and, you know, to everyone, honestly. You know, how people used to say, oh, that's a third world country. People don't say that anymore. It's underdeveloped country. And just those terms that we're using, and it's just hard to follow those. So when we try to talk about racism, when we try to bring that up, it's hard to do that because we always feel like we're not saying the right things the right way. And it's a sensitive issue as well because it wasn't that long ago, and people want to say that it was a long time ago, but it really wasn't.
What about between the definition between prejudice and racism? Those words seem to get intermingled.
I think that it's because the majority of the time that you use the word prejudice, it's based on race, and so I think that's why they get kind of intertwined and they're almost used as synonyms. But I don't think that should happen, because when you use race, people instantly think, what's the color of your skin? Race defines men or women, the color of your skin, what religious affiliation are you, everything. Just race is such a huge term, and people don't, you know, take the time to really think about how big of a term and how
we're really, pretty hypersensitive, I think, at this time. We don't have much, we only have seconds left. Not enough time. But you know what? We didn't want to solve the issue. We want to talk about the issue. And I think what you said is we don't know how to talk about it, which I think is what we need to explore. Hey, thanks for listening to the Dawn Newton podcast. I also want to thank my millennials, Monica, Maya, Isaiah, and Stephen. The article that we referenced can be found at slate.com. This article was dated May 16th, 2014. The article title, Why Do Millennials Not Understand Racism? More information about me can be found at dawnnewton.org. The Dawn Newton podcast is written, produced, and hosted by Dawn Newton.